Hey everyone, it is Ed Gutowski. What I wanted to do was I wanted to sort of create a video in which I focus on the first aspect of our class, because the first part of our class we're going to be dealing with rhetoric and argument. So what I want you to do is to kind of watch this video that I'm creating here, and this is kind of the same sort of lecture that you'd get if we were teaching a ground class. And then also there are two additional videos on our Canvas site, and these will help us to better understand what rhetoric is and what argument is. And then after you've watched these videos, there's a discussion board post that asks you basically during these three videos, how would you define rhetoric and why? So the couple things we should know about rhetoric and argument is that rhetoric and argument are linked. You can't have one without the other. So before we can start talking about an argument, we have to ask ourselves that question, what is rhetoric? So when I pose that question to a ground class, sometimes students get really nervous. You can see that there are students who are kind of panicking. Some students have never heard the term rhetoric. And some students, they've heard the term rhetorical question, but they don't really know what the term rhetoric means. So if you're in that case, you're in that situation, you're totally fine. That's kind of normal for students to kind of be in. So there's three things that I want to do in this video. What I first of all want to do is talk about the people who use rhetoric. I want to talk about forms of rhetoric, and then I'm going to give you my definition of rhetoric. So generally in a ground class, I can say, okay, look, we have no idea what the term rhetoric is, but it's safe we can assume that there are people who use rhetoric. And most students agree, okay, yeah, we know that there are people who use rhetoric. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, who are the people that use rhetoric? The number one group, hands down, any class will say, is they'll say politicians. Politicians are always associated with rhetoric. So if you think about it, we live in really interesting times right now. We know that the Democratic convention has just ended. And so somewhere along the past week or so, you might have heard Joe Biden is using rhetoric. Don't know what that word means, went out one ear, out the other, but okay, I know that Joe Biden is using rhetoric. We know next week Donald Trump is going to accept the Republican nominee for president, and we'll probably hear Donald Trump's rhetoric. Right? So politicians are a group that's always associated with rhetoric. Now the second group that students pick is they pick lawyers, right? Lawyers are always associated with rhetoric. And if you think about what lawyers do, right? They make arguments, right, in many cases. So that's a great way to link rhetoric and argument, because lawyers use rhetoric, and when they go to court, they have to make an argument. Third group that's interesting enough, right, is a lot of times students will talk about philosophers, right? We've heard of Socrates or Plato, right? So we know that the Greeks and the Greek philosophers use rhetoric. And then sometimes students will say, well, hey, teachers use rhetoric, English teachers use rhetoric. And I always point out, well, hey, if English teachers use rhetoric, so do students. Students always use rhetoric, and they're not very good at it, right? So if we have a sense, okay, here are the people who use rhetoric, politicians, lawyers, philosophers, teachers, then I want to talk about forms of rhetoric. So what might a form of rhetoric be? So if we think about it, and I'll use kind of the example of, say, former President Barack Obama, right? Obama was a politician, he used rhetoric, and a ground class will say, well, how many people have heard Obama speak? And a lot of people will say, yeah, they've heard Obama speak, right? So that just tells us that a speech, at a basic level, a speech is a form of rhetoric. So a speech might be a form of rhetoric, but then I can flip that question and say, well, how many people have heard former President Barack Obama speak live in person? And it's very rare, but every once in a while I'll get a student who said, yeah, they've heard him speak in person. Well, I'll say, well, how is it possible that we've heard President Obama speak but not live in person? And then people will say things, well, TV. So TV could be a form of rhetoric. Radio could be a form of rhetoric. The internet could be a form of rhetoric, right? And then sometimes students think, well, if we look at the written word, newspapers, books, and magazines can be a form of rhetoric. So if we talk about books, newspapers, and magazines being a form of rhetoric, then we can talk about the people who use those forms of rhetoric are journalists, or they're authors, or they're novelists. So all we've done here is I've said, okay, here are the people who use rhetoric, politicians, lawyers, philosophers. We know that there are forms of rhetoric, whether it's a speech, whether it's TV, a newspaper or a magazine. Now I'm going to give you my definition of rhetoric. And my definition of rhetoric is words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and to con people. So my definition of rhetoric is words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and to con people. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to let that first part of our lecture just kind of stay there. And what I want you to do is I want you to watch the 2 other videos on Canvas that talk about rhetoric. And then at the end of watching those videos, I want you to think about how you would define rhetoric. And then there's a discussion board where you can basically define rhetoric however you want. You can agree with me, you can disagree with me. Just kind of talk about why you agree, why that's your definition of rhetoric. And then with the discussion boards, I also want you to respond to another student's post. And then I'll look forward to seeing what you come up, and we'll just kind of continue having a discussion about rhetoric and argument.